For the next hypothesis, they were arguing that there wouldn't be a difference in reports of negative experiences in personal relationships. And so, just so we're all on the same page, this is essentially like in your own relationships, how often are you disagreeing or getting into fights, or if there's any kind of negative emotion. And what they found is a sort of a gender difference, but overall, not really. And let me get into that. So, women did report more negative interactions with family members, or at least reported them more often than men. But men reported more negative interactions with people who weren't family members or non kin. So, people like their colleagues, people they work with, or neighbors. And so, when they added up all of those negative interactions, both for men and for women, there were no substantial differences in total number of negative experiences. But it's just that who the person was interacting with or who they had the negative experiences with differed. I think this is a kind of an interesting finding because research on adolescents and their parents shows that adolescents are more likely to fight with moms than dads. And so that finding coincides with this one in a lot of ways. Not that all of these people are parents or parents of adolescents, but this idea that women who they tend to say are more affiliative, although there are individual differences, are having these more negative interactions with family members. But taken together, again, hypothesis two is saying that there's no real difference in total number of negative experiences. Hypothesis three was that there would be no difference in loneliness experienced in late adulthood. And what they found here is, first of all, the loneliness ratings were fairly low. So I don't remember what the scale was exactly on, but let's say it was on a scale of 1 to 10. And, the average was only around a 2 or a 2.5. It was something along those lines. So overall, the number of people who were experiencing loneliness in late adulthood was fairly low. But when they looked at it from the perspective of a gender difference, is they didn't find a gender difference. There was no real difference in loneliness in late adulthood between married men and married women. And lastly, for hypothesis four, they were arguing that the quality of marriage would be associated with loneliness in a similar way or pattern for both men and women. And that's what they found. They found that for both men and women, because again, these are married men and married women, perceived availability of emotional support from a partner was related to less loneliness. Let me unpack that one a little bit. This is the idea that if you think that your partner would be there for you to help you through emotional situations, then this was basically a protective factor and you were less lonely. So if you perceive that that person would be there for you and support you emotionally, then it was associated with less loneliness. And then they also found that negative interactions within a marriage contributed to loneliness, again, for both married men and married women. So to unpack that one, the more negative interactions you had with a spouse, the more likely you were to report being lonely within that relationship. But no differences between men and women. So taken together, I know that in some ways we're talking about marriage, in some ways we're talking about social relationships broadly, but I think this study is particularly interesting because it's showing that by and large, men and women are pretty similar, at least in this representative Dutch sample. So often when we talk about relationships, we talk about how women are like this or men are like this, but this is an example of a study that found and both predicted and found very few gender differences. And really the gender differences in this were not even all that substantial. So that's the reason I decided to include it in today's lecture. So friends are just one type of relationship that we have within our social networks. And so for the remainder of the slides and the different topics or different types of relationships today, I'm going to be talking about what those look like in midlife, at least briefly, and what those look like in late adulthood. So with friendships, in midlife, we often see that friends kind of get put on the back burner Friends are exceedingly important in adolescence. Obviously, we also talked about friendships in childhood. Friendships are exceedingly important in emerging adulthood. But as we start to get older and our lives become, in some ways, more complicated, especially for those people who start romantic relationships and are really focused on their partner, people who are focused on child rearing, then we start to see this time where we're spending more time with family than with friends. Um, are there individual differences? Of course, and you can imagine this in your own life. Some of you probably have parents that don't really have any friends, or maybe they're, I mean, friends with each other, but they don't really have other friends that they hang out with. I certainly know people like that in my own life. And some of you may know people who have, again, in midlife, who have lots and lots of friends, and they frequently have girls' nights or poker parties or whatever it may be, barbecues with all of those friends together. So yeah, there are lots of individual differences, but when we look at it over time and over the lifespan, it's midlife where we see almost friends being least not appreciated. I don't want to say that, but we just don't have as much time for them. Nevertheless, research still shows that hanging out with friends is and having friends is really, really important. It's positive for us overall. It makes us more resilient and helps with our mental health. It's a protective factor from stress. Recall the finding that at any point in the lifespan, having at least one friend is a buffer against negative experiences. And there's been copious research done that has looked at the role that friends play in protecting us and various negative outcomes. So even in midlife, this is still applicable. It's just that as a whole, we're spending less time with friends than at other points in our life. In late adulthood, we typically see, again, although people have varied life experiences, that once we have less family responsibilities, so our, children are often to college or the working world or adulthood, or maybe if you didn't have children anyway, work responsibilities are lessened. We're talking about after retirement for those who are able to have a life past retirement. Then once we don't have as many responsibilities, then suddenly it's like we have more time to devote to friendships. And it doesn't necessarily have to be friendships that we've maintained for decades. It could be with new friends. When we look at people who are in late adulthood and what they say about their friendships, they often report that these friendships are really meaningful to them. So again, it doesn't matter if this was a friend that they've had over a lifetime or a new friend, but going back to that first theory we were talking about and the idea that we're really choosing people who are kind of suiting us and who bring us joy. And so because of those things, then often these become very meaningful. Just like in childhood, people who are in late adulthood often are looking for friends who have mutual interests. This isn't just childhood, this is throughout our life too, but this becomes really, really important in late adulthood as well. It also, there's research that shows that friends bring us a sense of belonging. So it just raises that idea that we feel like we're a part of something or a part of a group. Sharing feelings and just having that intimacy is really important in late adulthood relationships. Not that it's not important in other parts of the lifespan, but it also becomes really important in late adulthood. And as I've already mentioned, lack of contact is really associated with poor health. I think I shared with you this story before, and if I did, you get to hear it again. And if I didn't, well, here it is. But I have a friend who is a massage therapist, and she said that one of the things that she's heard before from her elderly patients is that they come in to get massages just because they want to be touched by a human. Like they've lost maybe a significant other or don't see people very often. And so, like this is something that brings them joy or some comfort. And poor health can be both physical or mental here, or mental health related. But just in general, we know that friends are just so very important. I think about my grandma who lives in like assisted living kind of center, and she was living in a different place, and she was just talking about how people were really unfriendly, and I know she didn't go out of her way to be nice to people either, but and how it was really depressing because my grandpa had passed away years before that, and she was largely by herself most of the day. But now that she's in a new location and she has women to eat lunch with and to walk around the building with and things like that, even though they're living in their own spaces, this is making her feel much better, and her mental health has improved. I can't just say it's only because of the friendship solely. I don't know that. But I do know that having those people in her life is making it so that she can, have these mutual interests and feel like she belongs and share aspects of her life with people who are at a similar point in their lives. So I know that that's just an anecdotal evidence or a story, but the idea here is that we know this from research, lots and lots of research, that friends are buffers in our life.